Hello, everyone. Good morning, and hey, happy to be here. I know we have an exciting topic, uh, and we do have an extremely good and well-versed and experienced panelist along with us as well. So, first of all, welcome to the ArmorCode webinar: 5 steps to scaling vulnerability management in the age of frontier AI. Right? For some of you, may or may not be familiar with ArmorCode. ArmorCode is an agentic AI platform for unified exposure management. Right? We take all the way from code to cloud to infrastructure to development practices and bring all of the security related findings under one platform. And then we help, you know, prioritize, correlate the data that we get, aggregate the data to start with, and then we do contextualization of that information that we get it from the criticality of the asset, the threat intel and exploitability that comes along. And we correlate all of that information and help you prioritize where companies and organizations should be focusing on as they start to mitigate their exposure levels as well as findings and vulnerabilities, right? So the idea here is basically how do you stop chasing vulnerabilities and start, managing risks. So with that as being the broader ArmorCode backdrop, we have, we're fortunate to have several of our customers along with us today, participating as well as being on the panel, right? The topic for today is an exciting one, and I think very relevant to the timeline that we're living in, especially given that, the Mythos buzz has been almost, like 2 months, maybe a month and a half gone by, right? So when you talk about it, I think it brings us back to the fundamentals, right? 5 steps to scaling vulnerability management in the age of frontier AI, right? The problem has always existed, right? Finding new vulnerabilities has always been there. I think what has changed for us is two things. The volume has probably been, gone up for some organizations 10x, some organizations 100x, right? I've been talking to a lot of people offline and been getting that type of information, right? That's one aspect. The other aspect is there is no more, here's a low severity one or a medium severity one. The reality is about contextualization and vulnerability chaining and so on and so forth, right? Either people are kind of talking about Mythos, Daybreak, Project Glasswing, and so many things are going on. And these frontier models are kind of shining the light on already existing problem, but much more rapidly and much more faster pace. The bottom line is, again, it comes back to the foundational aspect of how do you prioritize? How do you define ownership? What kind of remediation capacity do you have? And how do you start to go about remediating and start doing it, right? And I think critical things there are technology aspects to it. There's definitely ownership aspect to it. Where do you attribute and how do you go about doing it? There's also process attribute, right? How do you go about doing it? So we'll probably unpack all of that today. So thank you for joining and I appreciate you being here today, right? Moving on, right? When we talk about five step to how do you scale vulnerability management, I think it all starts with discovery, right? And I think we'll unpack some of the concepts of how do we discover and how do you go about doing all of this stuff, right? It starts with discovery. Once you have discovered all of your capabilities, both your assets as well as vulnerabilities, either you're using a frontier AI model or, custom LLMs, or even using a traditional vulnerability management programs, you're going to, first of all, get to that wind of what is out there, right? Especially today with the AI scale, right? Second is about, beyond severity, right? Prioritization has to take into account, reachability, the exploitability alone cannot get it to it, right? So severity is an important element, but not the only thing. And we have been preaching, practicing, and we've been, pushing that concept for quite a while as all security practitioners. We are all in the call today, right? So I think the question now becomes is, exploitability, reachability, the business context, and the vulnerability chaining. All of that comes into play from prioritization, right? Once you have prioritized it, I think the difficult challenge has always been who wants to fix, right? The fix is actually cutting across, right? Like from engineering to security to engineering to development to product, but the ultimate ownership kind of lands in the leadership realm of things, right? And then you have pieces of the puzzle that's owned by different organizations. So we need to be able to have clear line of sight in terms of who's owning it so that we can keep them accountable and drive the program forward, right? And then, I think these first 3 steps gear us towards, where do we go now? We then now start to talk about, where do we need to get to the solution aspect of it, right? The remediation orchestration comes into a bigger piece when we talk about, right? So without overwhelming it, without chasing all sorts of things that we come and find out about it, right? With all the pieces that we have done, especially with the prioritization, we can now then start to talk about remediation and what that remediation looks like as well, right? And after all of that said and done, I think it's important for organizations to create an operating model that has an SLA established with it, that has got a method to the madness in terms of how you're going to discover, how you're going to go through this four-piece process all along and be repeatable, right? So that's going to be an important aspect of it, right? So I think today we'll look at it from the practitioner's lens, and we will look at how, our large organizations that we have, like, speakers today that we can definitely, I'll spend a minute to introduce them. And then we can talk about how they are embracing some of this stuff, right? And to all of this stuff, there has got to be changes to the way you're organized, change and, enhance the processes, aspects of your solutioning, obviously leveraging tools and platforms where and when possible to accommodate those pieces, right? So we'll kind of unpack this 5-step process in terms of how we would be managing vulnerability management, how we'll be managing vulnerabilities as we scale and as the AI throws more at us as security practitioners. So with that said, let me bring my speakers on and appreciate their time this morning. It's very valuable. First of all, I have Sunil Malik. Sunil is head of cybersecurity architecture and engineering at PayPal. Sunil has been a deep practitioner. I've known him for a long time. His focus has been on financial services, vulnerability management. How do we elevate the platform to be able to, in a sustainable state, that can deliver business value while not getting security challenges come along, right? So business impact he's a operational leader with like business impact at a very large scale, right? So thank you, Sunil, for joining us. Appreciate it. Next, we have Oz. Of course, Oz works for us, a security solution provider, is a director of security engineering at Fortinet. Oz brings a lot of security engineering and his perspectives as a security provider. Personally speaking, frontier AI perspectives will be very valuable for all of us to listen in from. Especially, I think he focuses on any exploitability, reachability, exposure management, and changes when AI assisted discovery is in play. Right. So thank you, Oz, as well, for joining here. And we have Nate. Nate has got a bigger plate that he kind of handles. He's SVP of Global Operations. He's got not just security, but he's got broader aspects of AI architecture and e-commerce at Solera. Right. And Solera is a very large conglomerate institution in the world that brings us various brand names and companies that operate under that umbrella. Right. Nate brings an operations and architecture lens, so slightly beyond security aspects of it for a highly complex global environment, including how he's using and leveraging agentic workflows, not just for security, but for the entire organization to adopt agentic AI workflows. And he talks about how he's trying to get agentic AI to get to 50% of the finished product to start with before a human touches it, right? So it's awesome, and it's amazing for me to have this esteemed panel as we unpack what are we doing, a month and a half away from, later, as Mythos have come along, right? So thank you all. So before we get started, I would like to get into a poll, right? I think there are 3 questions that, when I think of it, where are we right now? Is this is still a media buzz, Mythos? Has it quelled down? Is it another, standard security event that we have all seen this movie play time and time again, right? With that said, but I think it is slightly different. That's kind of my perspective, right? So I would like to run the poll. So I'll have Jeremy run the poll, right? Where are you in your, so not all 3 questions are going to come along, and we'll see each of their responses, right? So where are you in your Mythos preparation work? That's will be the first one. So if you all can take a few seconds to kind of give me that view, that'll be great, right? So all right. So I think we got a 35% participant, but that's okay, right? So I think it's very interesting. Where are you in your Mythos prep, right? It looks like about half of them are saying actively planning, assessing posture, and figuring out operationalize at scale, which is fantastic, right? I think we have started to subtly move from mobilizing to planning, right? So that's an interesting response. And we'll figure out, how we were feeling about this when Mythos just came out to the media, right? So, but it is still kind of saying we're just learning and talking internally. That's another almost close to 40%, right? And only 15% on an adapted state, right? Changes to workflow or tooling, which is a little bit surprising, but definitely, definitely in the right direction, right? So, I think moving on to okay. So, all right. So I think we can go on to the next poll, Jeremy. So I have three questions that I think we did ask a while ago, right? But about a month and a half ago, and let's just see what those how does that compare, right? So this one is about: are you already seeing effects from LLMs in detection or attack activity, right? Or, is your SOC picking up things, your incident responders picking up things, right? Is your scanners picking up things, and or your programs doing all of the stuff that we talk about, the effects of LLMs, right? Either that vis-a-vis that could be volume of AI related vulnerability, AI volume vulnerabilities, or vulnerability chaining, and so on and so forth, right? Let's see. Yeah, sure. So actually, somewhere in between feeling pressure but haven't fully assessed it. That's 37%. And 11% is like we don't have enough visibility to know yet, right? That's kind of very interesting. So I think I'll keep those two data points. Here is seeing detection. At 30% are saying uh, detection and or faster exploitation, right? Which is definitely interesting. And within 2 months, I'm not, I've not seen a whole lot of other security related events in the past history of cybersecurity that has moved as fast as we're seeing it right here, right? So let's kind of move on to the next one. All right. So this is our third and last poll for now, and then we'll dive into the topic. If Mythos class models surface 500 critical vulnerabilities in your environment tomorrow, what would actually happen? How would your organization respond? And so basically, you have a playbook, and you know exactly what happens within the first 24 hours, or will just still like escalate and scramble and get into a firefighting mode, or hey, we wouldn't be able to kind of deal with 500 new critical vulnerabilities tomorrow morning, right? So very hypothetical, but that said, it is very realistic. So that's definitely interesting, right? Our tools and teams would be still overwhelmed. Remediation would take weeks. I think that's because of the volume that we just talked about. And I think the reality is when you talk about 500 critical new vulnerabilities, if you start to apply these 5-step principles in terms of how do you prioritize, how do you contextualize, and how do you start to create, remediation, and where do you tie it back, and how do you distribute in terms of ownership, I think you will be able to get a better handle on it, right? The reality is it's not all 500 would be needing any kind of remediation, maybe a handful, right? So what the reality to get to that point takes a lot of effort, right? So I think the tools and teams getting overwhelmed. If I combine that with having a playbook, what triage with business risks, 20% of you guys have said that. You all have said that, you will have within 24 hours, you have a playbook to manage and triage within 24 hours. That's outstanding. I think, so I think we're adapting, right? So, all right. So let's look at what the similar responses from about 7 weeks ago, right? So the first one is like the last question, as you can see, as the first 500 vulnerability tools and teams will be overwhelmed, weeks to remediate. It was 35%. It's now more. And then how have a playbook and triage and execute it in 24 hours. It's just kind of very similar. I think we had better responses, about 30%. If I do the Mythos readiness, what are teams in the Mythos preparations? Like, do you have a plan? And getting up to speed. I think we're getting up to speed is we got a better response this time compared to last. So that's actually, getting into a better mode. That means we have educated our teams, and I think we know exactly what we need to do, right? At least more than half the organization said they are kind of in a getting up to speed stage, right? And with LLM effects on attack activity, our team seeing impacts from LLMs, definitely, back then we were saying, nothing concrete changed, but now we're saying we're starting to monitor and manage with all these models, right? So that's just very, very interesting and good to see it, right? So with that said, let's kind of move on to the topic for today. I think when you look at the topics, right? I think I'd like to spend some time on the problem itself, right? What are we looking at, right? Is it the volume? It's the speed of exploitation. It's the prioritization. It's the handoff between organizations, exposure, and remediation capacity, right? It's been 2 months, since Mythos media buzz has kind of settled, and organizations are starting to operationalize their response. When you step back from these headlines, what are some of the single biggest opportunity challenges security needs teams to get to head off, right? Is it the volume problem? Is it the speed of exploitation? It's prioritization, right? Based on your experience, and I think you guys been doing a lot, right? And your financial services probably seeing the volume. What's your take up until now?
Thank you so much. And also thank you so much for the invitation. And it's my pleasure to be in this panel. Just wanted to highlight that. So I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, I think the problem has never been finding vulnerabilities. It's all about the remediation piece, especially also validation piece. And the validation is still getting a bigger problem because all these AI-based findings, AI-generated findings are doubled, tripled, 10x, 100x. And we need to, as a security team, we need to validate these findings first. I think validation has been the key, and it's getting much more importance in our vulnerability management program. And I think most of these audience here will agree with me that this is not a Mythos specific problem. We all know this is coming. More and more capable AI models are coming. In fact, I think just at the beginning of this week, we started to see this new Chinese model, GLM 5.2, which is an open source, open weight model you can just download from Hugging Face. And there's a lot of comparison between this model versus Anthropic's or the high-end frontier model capabilities. And it seems like this model is already doing an amazing job. So you or attackers don't need to access Mythos or Fable or Daybreak kind of state-of-the-art models. Still, currently, the open source models, open weight models, are performing close to that performance actually. So which is a wake up call, I believe, for us. Like, we need to get ready for this for sure. This is not if, this is all about when we're gonna see this kind of flood of vulnerabilities. So I still believe that validation is one of the biggest problems in our validating these findings so we can prioritize the remediation efforts is one of the biggest problems right now.
Oh, thanks, Hans. I think as you highlighted, there's different models. It doesn't matter if it's Mythos or what, right? So I just jumping on to Sunil, what do you see as the challenge right now, from a problem perspective for large enterprises? I know you talk about a lot of foundational aspects of it as well. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Karthik, for having me here with the esteemed group of panelists. I think it's a very relevant discussion. So when it comes to the response side of things, right, the foundational practices that we have been kind of establishing, right, I think there is a need to accelerate them, right? When I say foundational practices, right, for a long time, there has been over-reliance on vulnerability discovery and assignment and SLA monitoring, right, to manage this risk. I think we need to fundamentally shift that approach, right, and shift it to more towards reducing persistence in our environment, right? And the way we do that is that we have short-lived sessions, we redeploy our infrastructure often, and then with a shorter cadence. We also kind of increase the presence of like some critical controls like multi-factor authentication, right, or just-in-time access, so that like even if like an external threat actor has access to those weaknesses in our environment, right, it will take them longer to kind of navigate and compromise our environment, and in many cases prevent it, right? So all those things that we have been doing and kind of like moving towards, right, including our journey towards zero trust, I think there is a need to accelerate those, right? And that needs to get the right level of priority with the leadership and the board.
I just wanted to add one more thing on top of Sunil. I think it's actually a great point about SLAs. I think when we think about SLAs, these SLAs are generally more relevant for human developers when they are doing the remediations. But in an agentic world, when agents are doing the remediation activities and coding, I think we need to rethink about the SLAs again, because our agents are really bound to SLA deadlines still, or we need to also change the SLA, change the SLAs, or think about the SLAs again and again, and understand that maybe agents don't need SLAs. They just when they find a vulnerability, they patch it immediately. It doesn't matter what kind of vulnerability it is. Like that's also something we need to think about again.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Dave, do you want to add? I know that you have, like, you talk about 50% AI generating code for you type stuff, right? So what do you think are some of the challenges and the problem that we're facing as we have like this vulnerability overload?
Yeah, and I'd like to also join my colleagues here. Thank you for hosting this, and really happy to be here. The way I look at these things isn't so much of a practitioner, but an operator. So I bring a slightly different point of view. And when I look at things, I always look at things in context of scale. So it directly applies to what we're talking about here now. Our ability to scan has always been pretty decent, but with agentic processes, the scanning time, you can scan a lot more quickly. And development also accelerates how quickly new code ships, right? But the problem is kind of what Oz is alluding to, is that the human element there remains constant. So what you have here is you have two areas that are accelerating, almost hyperbolically, okay, and one that remains fairly constant. And that velocity mismatch is really where your problem sits. You can't hire your way out of that one. So the only resolution here is adding AI into your SDLC, for the entire flow, automating the remediation as the programming is happening, right? Not as an afterthought. So that routing layer, and the remediation, the risk grading, all of that has to be built into the same layer that does your scanning.
Right. No, I mean, that's kind of well said, right? I don't think so you can talk your way out of this problem that we're currently facing, right? And it's not about discovering and finding more vulnerabilities. Yes, we're keep adding more. I kind of feel like in ArmorCode, we do feel like we're adding tools and capabilities constantly. The industry is adding tools and capabilities to discover more. I mean, but the real bottleneck is how much can I remediate, right? And where do I remediate? How do I optimize remediating, right? Can I get that bird's eye view to understand where the real problem that needs to be remediated and how that manifest is definitely a thing, right? As we kind of move along, right, I think it's great that we have kind of established the problem and we'll kind of sort of agree, and I'm sure the audience also agrees with the problem situation, right? SLAs, handoff, exposure, volume, and on so and so forth, right? Moving on, I think the answer lies in three fronts, I think, like always, right? And it's the people, process, and technology. And I like to kind of get to understand what are we doing in the last since the Mythos media buzz have kind of hit us in terms of. So we understand it. Let's talk about like actually how companies and enterprises are responding, right? Not just from a technology perspective, but from an operating model perspective. So let's just get to the next slide, Jeremy. Right. So when you talk about it, like, let's move on to one more. So the actions has got, like, again, as I said, like 3-4 process, right? People, process, and technology, like anything in the world for technology practitioners, right? When you kind of get to that, the risk appetite is kind of becomes a central question, the post Mythos era, right? Now, Sunil, how do you, I mean, in a financial services environment, what is your risk-based prioritization? How do you go and handle this thing from a people process perspective as you start to, all right, I got it, I understand what I've been discovering, in now how am I going to go fix it, right? How do you get to the right people in the room?
Yeah. I'll kind of like start with like how we have been. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. So I'll start with like how we have been approaching it so far, right? Like, I mean, when we look at the risk, right, and like start with like exposure, right? Like externally, and then we look at like the exploitability factor, right? Is it being exploited in the wild, right? Or is this is a very novel vulnerability, and then the velocity, right? The time it will take to exploit, right? And then how fast it can move in your environment and what it can impact, right? So that's how we have been kind of looking at risk generally, right? And when we kind of report on these metrics, right? And risk, right? That's kind of how we layer it in, like external exposure, internal exposure, right? And then a order of priority tied to SLA, right? And how we're complying with it. I think where we need to sift is when we look at this group of vulnerabilities and then correlate them, right, to what can be exploited and what the blast radius is, right? I think those are the factors that we need to bake in, right? And I think that is where there is a tremendous opportunity with AI, right? Where we can truly use AI to get to a prioritized list of action instead of a list of vulnerabilities with SLA, right? I think that will help us communicate those actions to our stakeholders and also our leaders, right? Saying that here are the actions that we need to take, and for action, right, there is a potential impact, right, that can be on your environment, and that's where the operational risk comes into play, right? If there was no operational risk, right, we will patch everything instantly, right? But we do kind of take this approach of prioritizing and addressing patches in kind of like an order of operation, right, to manage our operational risk. Now, where we stand with our risk appetite today may shift in the very near future, right? As we kind of look at these vulnerabilities and as kind of the window for exploitation, right, comes down, right? We are already seeing that. We have data points to reference it, but like it will become more real when we kind of like apply that to our environment, right? As that window shrinks, right, we need to kind of increase our risk appetite as it relates to like having the operational event resulting from patching, right? And that communication is very important, right? But that type of communication truly needs aggregation at the action level, and then kind of showing what is the potential impact to your environment when you proceed with those actions without the traditional testing process that we have built in, right, for deploying patches, right? And having that conversation with your leaders, with your risk organization, with your board is very important, right? But it's all driven by data. It's all driven by data.
Yes. Are you redefining your entire, discovery to remediation process then?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is the redefinition focuses on how do you prioritize? Does it even focus on what your risk posture or tolerance can be?
Mhm.
You have a flexibility to say, well, yeah, I'm going to give you a little bit more lever, but posture can be, because you need to move faster. Or do you also talk about, what are the consequences, and impacts to your leadership if some things have not.
We have to, right? Because if you swing those windows up for patching, right, we are going to forego some of the testing and the assurance that we have built into our processes, right? And that may potentially can impact your infrastructure, right? And to some extent your customers, right? So having that clear understanding, right, is very important. We saw kind of like this type of shift like with cloud, but with cloud it was not as significant, right? Because like the way we test and apply and time to exploit didn't significantly change. The attack surface changed to some extent, right? But in this case, right, I think it is more I would say like impactful, because the time to exploit, if that swings, right, that impacts your entire operation.
Yeah. No, that's amazing that you guys, everybody's not set on stone and revisiting their existing processes, existing way of kind of risk calculating and risk, posturing and tolerance, acceptance and things like that, right? Just slightly moving on, like, I'll go to Nate. I've been told early on in my career, you tell me what I should be asking you, Karthik, because you're my security practitioners by my leaders in my practitioner days, right? Well, how has that changed, right? Like, what should a senior leader should be asking? And I think this is relevant to the audience because they should be able to go back to and tell them, hey, these are the things that you should be asking me. And then, that way you're establishing what we're monitoring and capable, right? So right now, how would you characterize what a senior leader should be asking their teams to understand what actually is the challenge and how we go about doing it?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of really good questions there. One is kind of an extension of one that's on this deck here. So if a frontier model surfaced 500 criticals tomorrow, would you be able to tell within the hour where each one of those lives and who owns it? Okay, because if you do not have clear accountability into your code paths and your solutions, well, that ambiguity is where remediation goes to die. Okay. So if that's a gap, you need to fix that gap and now. And are you measuring time to remediate? Because time to detect is now 0. Okay. That's a solved problem. So the metric that really matters is, gap closure, remediation, time to remediate. And then, it's kind of similar to the first answer is on accountability and, do you have a good asset and dependency inventory? Is it good enough to automate that you can route work agentically? Or are you still reconciling spreadsheets across business units?
Yeah. So obviously bringing some level of automation and method to the madness, it's definitely kind of needed. And you're absolutely right. Ownership attribution is key, right? When you're going into the value, right? So from a software company perspective, or your experience being in this, product side of the house, how do you, more from a security infrastructure perspective, what are you seeing change in how teams approach exposure management, especially in this world?
Absolutely, yeah. Severity based remediations are now dying, especially with this AI mythos era. You need some, as Sunil and Nathan also touched on that, we need more like a risk-based remediation right now. And this is the changing trend across the board in all industries. And as having additional context added on top of the identified vulnerabilities is super critical. Like if it's externally exposed, if it's a business critical application, if it's handling sensitive data, if it's like maybe a compliance, if you have a compliance requirement, if it's a compliance asset. Yes, having a CMDB or asset management solution, feeding data into your vulnerability management program and remediation program is going to be right now is the key. And I believe, yes, having like ArmorCode like ASPM or exposure management solutions kind of very much helps on that area, because you can add this additional context on every individual, additional context on the assets, and every finding will have a new risk calculation instead of the severity, static severity-based calculation. And that will help us, help everyone to remediate, especially in the age of AI, for sure, 100%.
Okay.
And also, I think one thing that's also important here I would like to touch is, as you mentioned, finding the owners. Who's going to be the owner of that remediation? In companies, this can be potentially a problem that can be solved, but I think we need to also think about the open source community, especially with the AI and all these models are getting popular. These open source developers are getting a lot of findings reported to them. And on the other side, if as a security researcher, if you find a vulnerability in an open source library, who is going to be who I am going to report to? I don't know their ownership of that open source library. It's a guy on the internet. I guess I can see some names in the GitHub repo, but finding the owners of the third-party libraries is also going to be a problem, and we are all relying on these third-party libraries and their vulnerabilities, their security as well in our organizations. So that's also another challenge in that era, AI era, Mythos era.
Okay. All right. No, that's kind of, I think I picked up a few things, right? I think you said one is, kind of the ownership that you talked about. The other one I think Nate was talking about is which teams and how fast and where do I focus on prioritization, right? I think all of this stuff, funnels into having a platform, and then the platform may not kind of point out how do I just like aggregate information, but also having, where does this vulnerability contributing back to my product or a business unit or a business line, who owns that and what are the makeup of that stuff, to your point about like open source and things like that. So a platform should not just say, well, I'll tell you which vulnerability is bad, but it should really be able to give you all the context and then leverage that to dynamically, shift through that data that changes almost on a regular basis, right? Especially, point of, exploitability interest as well as availability to exploits are also kind of relevant to that mechanism. It sounds like, so before we dive in, what I do want to do it is, from a practical perspective, what do we need to do for AI, accelerating AI discovery, the teams are under pressure and need for better prioritization and ownership, right? But what is the real bottleneck, right? So I think companies, it's easier to say, well, okay, can I go ahead and deploy this, or can I change the organization, right? But love to hear from you all. I'm sure everybody can see if everybody else is dealing with the same problem that they see as their day in, day out challenges. So love to get on a poll and see if I can get some pulse check in terms of what is your biggest bottleneck in this vulnerability management journey as we speak right now. So is it too many findings, not enough capacity? Is it not able to prioritize? Is it, I don't know who owns it so that they can fix it? Is it vulnerability chaining? Is it whack-a-mole problem, right? So hopefully you guys can see the poll come up. Yeah. Got about 1/3 of our participants responding, but let's see if we can get a little bit more response, because this is very critical, right? Like, I think every organization is going to be different in terms of where their bottlenecks challenges are. But I think if we know, we can also definitely share this information and exchange offline as well. All right. So I think hopefully everybody can see the results on the screen, right? I think one good thing I take out of this stuff, we're in a whack-a-mole mode and no strategic program yet, right? So that's 9%, which is good. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, and I would be surprised more companies, fall into that bucket because there's too many priorities, right? And it's also, but if you really look at it, I know we had a decent level of response, but it's equally split among the other 4, right? Literally, right to the dot, right? Too many findings, not enough capacity, prioritization, engineering ownership, vulnerability chaining, low severity issues, and we might be ignoring that critical risk, right? It's kind of interesting. So I would probably say all of us have very similar challenges, and probably each one can feed into it. It's probably difficult to say, well, I have both of these challenges, right? Too many findings and not able to prioritize, right? So that's an interesting insight, right? I'm not sure if anybody was surprised with these results or not, right? So
one thing I would like to also emphasize, if I may. Again, security finds that devs ignores that, right? These findings. I think one of the biggest one of the biggest challenge we have is again, especially in the age of AI, is the validation, as I mentioned in the beginning. So if you're just dumping unvalidated issues into developers, thousands of issues, especially with the AI, if you just forwarding that hundreds of thousands of issues to devs, they're gonna start ignoring you for sure, 100%. Yeah. And we need that validation stage. We need to validate these issues, understand if this is really exploitable, and then prioritize and send this to developers. Especially AI cheats a lot. If you're using AI as a secure finding vulnerabilities, AI cheats or finding vulnerabilities, and you will have a lot of non-real unreal vulnerabilities that don't be reported by AI, you need to validate these issues. I think most of these AI-based pen testing solutions out there, one of the biggest challenge that they are dealing with is the validation of the findings that AI found in these applications.
Yeah, validation for sure. Thanks. Yeah. So when you kind of moving on, right, a practitioner's point of view from a platform-centric solution, it's like kind of what I would say is the third piece, third leg to this tool, right? So Jeremy, if you can move on. So platform-centric solution, which actually talks about how do you bring all of this stuff to, and then also help you, right? And I think as you just touched on, how do you leverage AI to validate, especially, not only just finding it, right? So I think from an ArmorCode perspective, we have what we call as Anya Agents, right? So which actually comes into play quite a bit these days, right? It actually has got a zero-day hunting agent, which can correlate threat intel that it's got. So we're actually taking all these correlation aspects and kind of feeding that into an agent-centric approach. So it's a zero-day hunting agent. Having a remediation agent kind of tells you where do you generate the code fixes and how do you fix it. And then there's a triage and risk agent that as I think you kind of touched on, right? So can you validate the findings that we have seen it, and is that finding real, and how do we attribute to it, right? So it's kind of where the Anya agents will come into play for us as well, right? So, and Anya agents are kind of part and parcel of the platform itself. Yeah, tooling. Yeah. So basically, what I really want to do at this stage is to be able to move on to understand what are the technical aspects of the solution that you guys are all leveraging, right? For example, Sunil, and I'm sure for large financial services enterprises that you kind of handle with, right? What are the practical stuff? What is the technology layer? Do you have platforms that helps you do that, or you're consolidating? I think in our last conversation, you said kind of you're consolidating, right? So if you can touch on that, that would be fantastic, right? This is an opportunity for you to shore up. How do you handle all of these risk aspects, right?
Yeah. So look, when we look at vulnerability, right, and use that as a broad terms, right, in my mind, right, I can, if I can simplify it, we kind of like put them into three different buckets, right? Like one is like our infrastructure, right, that all our applications run on, right? Then you have your code layers that can include like bespoke code or your open source code that you bring into your environment, right? And then you have your like third party ecosystem, right? Like that's like your COTS applications, SaaS applications, right? That you bring into your environment, either integrate in your environment or deploy in your environment, right? To provide business capabilities, right? And vulnerabilities can exist across all three stacks, right? And then you have multiple detection sources, right? Identifying vulnerabilities in these stacks, right? Including your threat intelligence process that kind of brings the intelligence from outside. This for a large enterprise is like volume of data, right? Large volume of data, right? But when we kind of back to like the point that Oz was making, right? When we communicate bit back to our stakeholders to fix things, right? We need to answer two things, right? One is like, so what, right? If you don't fix this, like what will happen? What's that worst case the scenario, right? And then for your leadership, they need to understand like what is my exposure, right? Like this is the bad thing that can happen, but like what is the blast radius and what are the business processes that can get impacted? Because at the end of the day, right, that is where the risk is, right? For us to kind of go from this volume of data, right, to insights, right, risk insights, and answering that so what, right, you need to take a platform centric approach, right, because you are taking information from all these detection sources, right, correlating them. You are running your correlation engine, right, and then you are also bringing the business process context into it, right, and for handling that, right, you do need to take a platform centric approach, right, and the more consolidation you can have, right, where you can bring all these data sources into a singular platform, the better you are in terms of providing insight.
Yeah, like that's an interesting, because I know a lot of legacy enterprises kind of probably have multiple platforms, right? And it's not an easy journey, but I completely see your point, right? Bringing all of it into one single platform, right? And when you double click it, what I mean by platform is, I think what you're referring to, Sunil, is having an ASPM platform and infrastructure vulnerability platform, and then code-related vulnerabilities and findings coming into going to a different platform. How are you going to correlate it? How are you going to tag it back? And how are you going to attribute back to your business to say, hey, what is going to be impactful from your business perspective, right? I think that's kind of where I think the platform consolidation and convergence more than consolidation would make a lot more sense, right? Like it's 1 + 1 = 3, or you can probably say, well, if I don't, and especially I think in the day of vulnerability chaining that we're talking about it, how is it even practical if you have multiple platforms, like, to get that risk-centric view, right? So,
Just to add to that, right, Karthik, like I think that is where also like AI presents us the biggest opportunity, right? Because like with this volume of data that we have been trying to make sense out of like for a long time, AI can truly like help, right? To kind of get to it and bring to insights. Sorry, I interrupted. Maybe
Go ahead. No, makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Nate. So.
No. I was just adding in. I mean, another thing to think about in the same context that Karthik and Sunil are talking about here is, regardless of the platform, regardless of the tool chain, you have to approach the entire flow agentically, not just pieces, right? Everything from ideation, so whether that's a report on risk posture for gaps you need to close, or new product features, or whatever we're talking about, because agentic development essentially evaporates the time it takes to develop things. Anything that you bolt on after the fact is the de facto bottleneck. Okay. Security is a big one. If you have it write code, but not write perfectly secure code, that's a wrecking ball to your SDLC, right? And when attackers can run exploit agents continuously, your remediation logic has to run continuously too, and inside the same flow that produces the code.
Yeah. So you have to recalculate risk constantly as it comes along, right? And having that platform would be good, right? I think this is a fantastic conversation, and I think that having a unified exposure management type of platform can probably lead or lend itself to help you with continuous risk calculation, risk monitoring, as well as, to Sunil's point, how do you kind of converge it and do it, and know the consequences of it, and then drive remediation faster and more precisely, right? With that kind of said, like, I think, Jeremy, if you can move on to that, so what do these agents kind of do, right? The agents help you find the findings, triage the findings, explain the risk faster and better in a business context. They can also let you know if there's any kind of a 0-day exposure that you have as a result of some of the vulnerability chaining that we can do, right? With supply chain data that may be there, the type of CVEs that we're going to constantly find, and then also generate much more faster, more cleaner, more tighter code fixes, right? Generate code aware remediation guidances, right? So those are some of the benefits that we get. So going back, I think Oz made a point. I think we need to fight AI with the AI kind of a philosophy. And I think this kind of lends itself, right? That part of the platform is kind of very, interesting. Obviously, this is Anya Agents that some of you are leveraging, and then you'll continue to leverage, right? So the other thing is, I think we do have what's called a 90-day plan for operating AI scale vulnerability management. So if any of you are interested, if you can scan this QR code, which is on your screen, and then we'll also share this material, you can take the next step, right? Like, if you as we saw, what are the big bottleneck challenges, right? Like everybody said, like, we're kind of, mobilizing and forming and storming before we get to that. I think front AI blueprint is a very interesting approach and a good 90-day plan. So, which we have consolidated based on experiences that we have learned from several of the institutions that we have worked with. So if you want to take this, that would be an awesome thing. I think I've done it for ArmorCode, and ArmorCode as, customer number one for us, which kind of gives you more practical play. It's not just a lone platform. It's not just a lone tool. It kind of gets into the people, the process, the organizational restructuring, the way you would explain risk, and so on and so forth, right? So more than feel free to take that if that's of value to you. It doesn't take a lot of time. So that's one I will leave alone with you guys, and then go ahead, Jeremy. There's also want to make a plug to say we do have the PBC Connect event. Several of you are PBC members, Purple Book community members, and it's an amazing community which kind of gives back to the community as well as learns from each other. So we have, based on popular demand, I think we have another session coming up as part of Black Hat. So if any of you are participating, coming to Black Hat, please feel free to look up. And this is on August 4th. Phil Venable, several of you might know him, and then Jason Clinton from WCSO at Anthropic. Good conversation on, again, continuing this conversation about vulnerabilities in the world of AI.
So this is an interesting point. So tangent to this, Google's threat intel group recently reported that some of the new vectors coming in aren't necessarily the models themselves or being used to find exploits. It's the connective tissue, right? So the API endpoints, the wrapper libraries, skill configuration files. So I think this goes into, when you say harness, that's how I kind of read this, right? What insights are being used to strengthen your harnessing? I would think traditional approaches, like Sunil mentioned earlier with multi-factor authentication, things like that. But really, that connective tissue is definitely going to be a target in this new agentic space.
All right. Thank you, Nate. And hopefully this session was valuable to each and every one of you. And any one of you are going to tune into recording, tune into listening to the recorded session. And please feel free to engage continuously. And if there's anything that we can do to help from an ArmorCode perspective, I'd love to do that. Again, I would strongly recommend and encourage for you to take the QR code that was displayed earlier to do, and almost like Mythos readiness, or Mythos is an overused term, maybe a frontier AI vulnerability discovery readiness program. Right. Thank you very much for your time and participation today. Thank you.